This is the podcast Discussion Leadership for the North Korea Files podcast. This Planet Money podcast focuses on North Korea, which is sometimes called the Hermit Kingdom because it's isolated and doesn't do business with the rest of the world. The United States has imposed the strictest sanctions possible against North Korea, and the Planet Money team talked with some individuals who are applying to the U.S. Treasury Department to do trade with North Korea. One wants to import postage stamps and sell those. Another gentleman wanted to import a pair of North Korean-made jeans for his wife. The team also talked to a small firm of Swedish folks who were actually making jeans in North Korea. And then finally, they talked to an individual, or actually talked about an individual, who was an importer-exporter who it was suspected might actually be a spy. This podcast relates to a couple of microeconomic concepts from our first couple weeks of classes. First, the podcast talks quite a bit about trade, in particular international trade. It discusses some of the reasons that people want goods, for their kitsch factor, to make profit, etc. It also talks about the idea of trade as a political, cultural, or religious tool. In talking about North Korea, there's also a suggestion that perhaps this is an example of a country that's an autarky, given its government ideology of being self-sufficient. Another concept that relates to this podcast is the idea of a centrally planned economy. North Korea has a government that sets their economic goals. For instance, they talk about the idea of the country having a goal of making jeans and then working with the Swedish company to do that. They also talk about the problem that because there's no market to support achieving those goals, they had trouble accessing buttons, getting fabric, etc. This podcast relates to two of the economic tenets that are important for this course. First, it relates to the idea that incentives impact choice in predictable ways. The United States and other countries have imposed trade sanctions on North Korea in an effort to impact their policies. As discussed in this podcast, it's not quite clear if that's actually effective. The podcast also relates to the tenet that voluntary trade creates wealth, because it talks quite a bit about trade, and actually it expands that idea, talking about trade in order to promote religious views, cultural exchange, and to influence policy, in addition to creating wealth. I'd like you to think about and comment on two discussion questions online for this podcast. First, why do you think that the U.S. government authorizes some of the applications to trade with North Korea, even though they keep the sanctions in place? And then your second question will be to discuss, recognizing that North Korea is an extreme example, what do you see as the pluses and minuses of a country having a more centrally planned or command-type economic structure?